Hello, comic creators. Welcome to this week's episode of the Comics Connection podcast, a podcast where we talk about both the business and creative side of being a professional comic book creator. I'm Gamal. I usually talk about the business side. He's Andy. He talks a lot about the business and creative side because he actually knows both. So, Andy, I think what we're going to start out with is this idea that was actually in the Comics Connection Discord, the Discord where we actually have all of our members talk about the different aspects of the business that we're working on. And a lot of things, a lot of the discussion actually revolves around how do you actually break through and have a career? So you're working full time in the comic book industry. And one of the topics that actually come up very recently is the idea of tying something like Kickstarter to Kevin Kelly's like 10,000 fans theory. Now, are you familiar with the 10,000 fans theory?
I
Not
think it's only
10,000 fans, I'm
1,000.
sorry. It's
It's
a
1,000.
thousand fans. It's a
Yeah.
thousand.
I am familiar with the theory, but why don't you let our listeners know what it is?
Okay, so just the 10,000 foot view is there was a writer named Kevin Kelly who back in 2003, long before Kickstarter or anything else, actually had a theory that said if you're a creative person, and he, in his example, he used musicians, if you had 1,000 people, the entire, that's all the people that knew about you, but they were very passionate about your work, and they spent, if you made some something every year that cost $100, $100 times 1,000 people puts you into the position where you are now a full-time musician. You don't need millions and millions of copies sold. You don't need a huge record deal. You just need 1,000 people to really be into what it is you're doing. And this actually translates into what is called the 1,000 true fans rule. So for comics, I feel like in a lot of ways, Kickstarter is a perfect way to actually define who your true fans are, because these are the people that are going to spend usually more than what a regular comic book costs to acquire your book because they want to be first, because they're really into your book. So if you can get 1,000 people consistently to back your Kickstarter, and you could actually get consistent production of your comics, of the material you're making, that could go a long way, in addition to direct market in bookstores and libraries and direct to consumer and everything else, into getting you to a point where this is all like a viable thing. So you're not really trying to get 10,000 sales in the direct market. You're not really trying to get, a blockbuster, Raina Telgemeier type numbers. Andy, you've worked in comics for a long time and you've just completed a successful Kickstarter. So, do you think Kickstarter is actually, well, first of all, what is your theory? What is your feeling on the 1,000 fans concept in the first place?
I think it's a lot easier to say 1,000 fans give you $100 and therefore you made $100,000 than it is to say 1,000 fans give you $100 and you spent $85,000 making that thing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's I don't know too much about the music industry, but I do know plenty of people who have like their own like recording studios and stuff like in their homes. Obviously there's an expense to get all that equipment, but let's say that's all paid off. Yeah, and you're just making a digital product that people will download. That's a very different prospect than making a physical product that you have to print, manufacture, ship out, all that kind of stuff, just because of the amount of costs that go into that. Also, with most comic creators, there's a team of people. They all need to be compensated. So that money starts to get split up much more quickly. So that's sort of like that's what makes comics a little bit more difficult than some other media. But I like the theory. Like, I mean, I think of it less of a rule than like a rule of thumb. Like that seems like a good milestone to try to get to. Like our Kickstarter, which was our first one, had about 250 backers. And it did well. We're happy with that. As we continue, we hope to grow that that number from one. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't understand is they expect that 1,000 true fans to show up on day one. That's something 1,000 true fans is not easy to get. Like you have to build to it. It sounds not that hard, but it's still quite difficult. Just even getting your work out in front of that many people where they take a look at it. Especially if you're asking people to read. Like people
Mhm.
don't like reading anymore.
Well, it's actually, you brought up a very good point about the concept of it being a rule of thumb, because when I first encountered the theory, I came to the conclusion that it really depended a lot on what medium you were talking about when you're trying to be
Yeah.
creative. Because if you're a sculptor and your pieces are going for 10, $15,000 a pop, you don't need 1,000. You need like 20 and you're done,
Yeah.
because the cost of the piece actually reduces the number of people you need. And the reason why I started out saying 10,000 fans instead of 1,000 is because when I extrapolated that out to comics, it seemed like 10,000 was the number that you needed. Not that they were going to, because you probably weren't going to produce $100 worth of material for people to buy every year. So you needed more people to buy like the fewer items you were creating. And
Hmm.
because your price point isn't necessarily going to be that high, you kind of need more people to spread out the cost in turn, and also to increase the revenue, because like you said, if you've got 4 people working on a book or 6 people working on a book, and each one of them needs to make this theoretical amount of money, then it's not 1,000 for comics, it's like 5,000, 10,000, because then it's covering those production costs you talked about, covering, spreading out the revenue to all the people involved, like you talked about. And if 1,000 people is not easy, because it's not, then 10,000 is 10 times harder. And it has to happen kind of like over time. But if you look at like what Iron Circus did with crowdfunding, or what a lot of people who have been in the crowdfunding game for a while, they may not have 10,000, but they're getting close. They figured out how to make those numbers work, where it's the bulk of their money is actually coming from a very small group of people who are intensely involved in what it is that they're doing, so that you're relying less on casual impulse buyers. So, how many? Well, I guess this is a theoretical question. For CEX, how many of these true fans, let's call them, if your first Kickstarter got you 250, how many, what kind of growth do you think you're looking at over how many years until you get to a point where you've kind of crossed that threshold?
My guess is it'll be several years. And part of that is because CEX publishes a diverse range of titles, like genre
Mhm.
wise and stuff. So I don't expect that because we got 250 people backing this one, that all 250 of them will, that back Midnight Tiger, a super teen superhero book, will back, a Western or, a sci-fi book or whatever.
Mhm.
So I think it's going to take quite a long time to build that. Do I think it's possible? Yes. But I think that is a long-term goal, and I think I'm being realistic about it. And I don't know that we'll achieve 1,000 on every campaign. I think that's a lot to ask for the comics market. It's possible. I've seen campaigns that have done it,
Mhm.
but they're usually, um, things like, you know, Sandman or, stuff like that. You
Well,
know,
that in that there you're talking about people bringing in a pre-existing fan base to actually
right?
back a project, which is a different dynamic. Well, it is the same dynamic, but played out over a much larger period of time in a much different context. Like if you look at what, like Coffin Comics, they are regularly making huge amounts of money off of the Lady Death series. But A, Lady Death has been around for 20 years. B, it's pretty much not safe for work, which actually does better in Kickstarter. And C, it already had a pre-existing fan base before they started the Kickstarter. So the same thing with like Keanu Reeves Berserker and Neil Gaiman and all of these other people, if they have those fans, they bring them in, and it actually makes it deceptive. It seems like it's easy to actually make a crowd Kickstarter happen when it is not, because the you need that pre-existing fan base, which means you need a certain amount of quality in the product that you have, which is going to be our segue into the second piece of this, where we actually talk a little bit, because we talk a lot in these past few episodes about a lot of the business and marketing and distribution and pricing and all of those other things. But I know you wanted to talk a little bit about the actual creative side of it and what it is that, emerging and independent creators should be looking to accomplish on that side. So I'm going to, let you have the floor, let you talk
Sure.
about
Enjoy your water.
it. Mm,
So yeah, so I basically, the reason I brought this up before we began recording was because we have been talking a lot about the business side, more so than the creative lately. And I meet a lot of people that want to get into comics and want their comics to sell well, and they approach things from like what we were just talking about. I need to get on Kickstarter, I need to do this, I need to do that, like all of these things. And like the story and the art and all that seems like an afterthought. On the flip
mm,
side, I run into a lot of people that do the opposite. They don't want to think at all about how are they going to sell it, consistent page counts from one issue to another. They're like, let the art be. If it's good enough, it'll sell. And reality is the two together, right?
mhm,
Um, Kickstarter or any crowdfunding platform allows more flexibility in terms of page counts and that sort of thing. But like if somebody is bringing a project to me, if I really like it, but issue 1 is 30 pages and issue 2 is 21 pages and issue 3 is back to 30 pages and issue 4 is 38 pages, I don't know how to price that as a miniseries, right? I can't just
mm,
slap a 3.99 or a 4.99 on them all, right? They almost, do I price them individually? Like in which case retailers and fans go crazy.
mhm,
So there really is this. I really think that the most effective approach is to really be working on both at the same time.
right.
And when you come up with a concept or whatever, run it through that business side. Be like, can I do it this way? How is this going to work on Kickstarter? Do I have a platform? Is there a way I can do a collectible that I could do at a higher price point? Is there, all that stuff. So it's not one dictating to the other, it's the two of them maximizing
Mhm,
what can be done with them. And so what I wanted to talk about here, because it is getting harder and harder in the direct market, sales are just down, retailers are holding on to their money more, um, which is fine. This happens every so often, right? But it's difficult when it does happen. So one of the things that is really important, for me personally, is evaluating, do I have a hook? Do
mhm,
I have a hook, and who does that hook actually hook? Right. um and I think getting a really solid premise that's very clear and very precise and very easy to explain, especially when you're starting out, is one of the best things you can do, because that will help you on all the business side, and it will also help you on the creative side, like stay true to what you're doing. I cannot tell you how many times I get asked to look at a Kickstarter like pre-launch or even after it launched or after it failed, and people, post online, I don't understand how this failed. It had all this great stuff in it. And then I click on the link, I go and I look at it, and I can't make heads or tails of what it was or who it was for.
mhm,
And so a lot of folks approach things of like, this resembles a lot of things that I grew up loving,
mhm,
right? And so it's like this weird like mishmash of things that you had to be 8 in 1993
mhm,
to really get into, right? Or you wind up with somebody doing some massive epic thing, and it's really hard to follow, and they forget the simple sort of rule. And even massive epic stories have something simple at their core. One of the things I do in our intro to writing comics class is I'll take really big, large-scale saga type stories and boil them down to a fairly simple premise. And one of the easiest is Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings, at its core, is there's a hobbit, like your least physically imposing type of person that inhabits this land, comes into possession of the one ring of power, the most evil and most powerful ring, and all his job is to kill it, is to destroy it. Now, the problem is, and where the story comes from, is that in order to destroy it, he has to walk seemingly across all of Middle Earth through multiple wars, climb up a mountain, and throw it in to the Mount Doom. So that's where all the story takes place. But at its core, like, that's something I can understand. There's a Dark Lord that's after this ring. If the Dark Lord gets the ring, that's it for everybody. This least suspecting person is who has it and who has to carry it and take it up there. So it's very simple conceptually. And a lot of people just don't understand how to boil they get into their story. That's part of it, is you're excited about your story, which is great, but you lose yourself in your story, and you need to be able to hone that down. And I think that's one of those things that it does get talked about, but I don't think it gets stressed enough, especially when you're starting out. Once you become Neil Gaiman can write a book and put it out and tell no one what it's about, and it will sell because it's Neil Gaiman. But until you're Neil, it's more of these sorts of these hooks and these premises that are gonna help move the needle.
Okay, can you actually explain, just from a technical standpoint, what you mean by a hook? Because I think a lot that word gets tossed around in literary circles, in comic book circles, but define what a hook is for those who have never actually come across the actual definition.
Well, in this case, when you're talking about like trying to sell a series, right? The hook is just the idea or the one aspect, and it can be an image. In some cases, it is an image that grabs people's attention and makes them go, I want to check that out, right? And so the other analogy I use is like the difference between buying a ticket to a movie and going to see it and coming back to see it a second time, right? So a really great ad campaign for a movie can have a hook in it, and you're like, oh, that's great, I want to see it. I just saw The Last Voyage of the Demeter a couple of weeks ago, which, if you don't know, in the novel Dracula, there's a ship, the Demeter, that Dracula like is below decks, like encased in Transylvanian dirt, whatever, and it comes to London. There's very little in the novel about the Demeter. Basically, we know that he gets loaded on there, and we know that when it arrives in London, everybody on board is dead. That's all we know in the novel. And so this group of filmmakers made this film about that journey and what happened on that journey. I think that's a great premise. I happen to be a Dracula fan, so I was like, this is great. I can't wait to go in. I was very excited. I bought my ticket, which they got my $12 or whatever it was, and I went to go see it. The movie itself was fine. It was not great. I don't need to see it again. Had that movie, the hook I thought was great. The execution of the story was not as compelling as I had hoped. Had it been really compelling, I would have gone back and seen it again and again, or taken in a sequel if they made a sequel, although maybe not. But I mean, that's the difference. Like there's how do you sell it, and what it is are not always the same thing. They're linked, of course, but they're not always the same thing. And on the flip side of that, I think there was a lot of interest in Raiders of the Lost Ark when it came out, but the reason that the Temple of Doom had a huge opening, the sequel, when it came out, was because people love the execution. Like, people went to see Raiders of the Lost Ark. They loved the guy with the hat and the whip and the gun and all that stuff. And so when the sequel came out, they were all about going to spend more time with Indiana Jones. The concept of Raiders of the Lost Ark is the search during World War II for the Ark of the Covenant, this sort of magical, mystical thing. That's a really cool concept. That's what got people kind of in the door. No one came out of Temple of Doom asking why the Ark of the Covenant was not in that movie.
Right.
Because that was the hook that got you in, but it wasn't the thing that made you fall in love with the story.
So it sounds like just to try to tie these two ideas together, it is going to be very difficult for you to grow your fan base to get to that point where you have those 1,000 or 10,000 or whatever number it is, if all you have is the hook. If all you have is things that gets them in the door in the first place and they're excited about the idea, but then the quality of your book is bad, the execution of your book isn't compelling, then no one will show up for the second one, which means you're constantly starting over. Like, let's say all you do is you make really good hooks. So every time you do
Right.
a book, it's a really good idea, but then
Yes.
you never actually execute, you never stick the landing. You will constantly get some people interested, but you'll never get them to stay with you on that kind of journey. So it seems like a lot of times I'll use I guess Alan Moore as an example of that, where okay, here's the hook, and then the execution may be superlative. So the next time he gives you a hook, you're like, okay, I may not even be that interested in this one, but the last three were so good. I'm gonna jump onto this one and see, just see what happens. So I guess what we're saying is to get the fans, you need both the hook to get them in the door and the quality of the book to keep them, on the ride. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. Both matter for sure. Because we sometimes have struggled with having a really quality book, but having a hard time figuring out how to sell it. Like, what is the
Mm-hmm.
hook that gets people in? Like, I know it's a really great book. If people read it, they will like it. But how do I get them to read it? Like, that's an issue. That can be really challenging.
Mm-hmm.
You'd like it not to be, but it is. On the other side, sometimes I've gotten some pitches in where I was like, this is a phenomenal hook. But then once I dig in, I was like, oh, there's nothing really here. Like the premise is great, but it's not, the execution just isn't there. And especially when, if I'm talking about doing a mini series, like it's 4 issues, and if issue 1, like if you buy issue 1, the hook is there, so you bought issue 1 and you read it, but the content isn't strong enough with a comic book series, you're not coming back for 2, 3, or 4, and I'm committed to publishing those, right? So, so yeah, it gets really scary. It's the equivalent of being like, well, I'll pay $2 to get into the movie, and 20
Mm-hmm.
minutes in, I'll let you know if I'm going to give you the other 8.
Yeah, yeah. Well, how do you actually deal with the hook and the actual content when you're teaching the classes?
Well, we talk about them sort of separately, and then we'll as students create their own comics or whatever, come up with their own ideas and notes, we'll try to help them meld them together. So that's a great story. How are you going to sell it? We'll talk through those things. Sort of, there is a process, I think, to figuring that out.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little bit more involved, um, but in some cases it's as simple as sort of a checks and balances sort of thing. Like, oh, I've got a story that I really love, but I don't have the hook yet. And sometimes that and you just tuck it in the back of your brain, and then one day something will strike you and the hook will appear. Um, I had a title that I really liked for a couple of years called 5 Days to Die,
Mm-hmm.
and I knew I liked the title, and I knew basically that the hook was that this guy was going to have 5 days before he died,
Mm-hmm.
but I didn't have the story. And
Mm-hmm.
then one day I was at an amusement park with my kids, and we were waiting in line for a Ferris wheel, and I don't know what it was about that Ferris wheel, but like the story dropped into my lap, and so I carry a little notebook, so I took it out in my back pocket and just wrote a few sentences, put it back in my pocket, and a year later, a 5-issue miniseries came out.
Nice, very nice. Now, in the process that you have with the class, when is the next class so that other people can actually go through this process and kind of build up the quality of their comics?
Well, that depends what day this airs, Gamal,
Well,
because
this is going to air on the 13th of September.
and today is the 12th, so it starts tonight is the answer.
Oh, so
We
okay.
should have done this last time, but But yeah, the intro to comics writing class from Comics Experience starts tonight. There are a few seats left though, so if you want to hop on over and click on it, we'll get you in. We'll get you in.
Okay, very good. And the class, but you do these classes like every like 4 months.
We do offer them. Yeah, the intro classes we tend to offer a little bit more frequently. It's usually 2 or 3 times in a year.
Okay, so if people hear it after today, they do not have to despair. They could actually check out the class another time. And there are several other different levels of class that Comics Experience offers. A lot of the links to the classes for the fall are going to be in the show notes for this episode, because that's going to do it for this episode of the Comics Connection podcast. Check us out next time, and we will come back to talk about both the business and creative side of making your comics. So until then, have fun with your comics.